Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovish, again with God's Physics, the book that has been published by iUniverse.com. And today it's an exciting presentation because the title of today's presentation is The Great New Hope of God's Physics' New Paradigm and the Power of Teshuva. That's part of the exciting developments in this new God's Physics paradigm, and it follows immediately and is very much related to Yom-Kippur and Rosh-Hashana of the Jewish people, but it's an integral part of this new God's Physics paradigm. So just maybe a few words for all of those viewers that have not been accustomed to or have not seen some of the previous presentations. I recommend everybody to read the God's Physics book. This was written for the general public as well as for scientists, and it lays out this revolution in science, this new paradigm of 21st century theoretical physics and science more generally. So just a few words about this new God's Physics paradigm for 21st century science, and how this is very and then I'll get into the great hope of this new God's Physics paradigm and the power of Chuva, which is today's presentation's topic. So as I said before, and as I've written, first of all, this new God's Physics paradigm has been published in over 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles, 2 special issues published by international scientific journals. I'm invited to open international physics conferences with a keynote lecture about the new paradigm, the new 21st century paradigm of God's physics. Previously, this theory has been called the computational unified field theory, after Einstein's visionary quest for such a unifying field theory. And that's probably a good place to start explaining this new paradigm, because we have to realize what many people are perhaps not aware of, that science is not a static and continuous endeavor. It evolves. As Thomas Kuhn, the known philosopher of science, tells us, it evolves by leaps or by alternating phases, in which one phase is the standard science, in which a scientific discipline evolves by investigating based on certain assumptions, certain paradigm. Take, for example, relativity theory. Relativity theory has been very useful and very successful in explaining various phenomena about the universe. Quantum mechanics, another example for the 20th century physics models, or part of the what I call the old material causal paradigm. Both relativity theory and quantum mechanics are part of this old material causal paradigm. And so quantum mechanics also has been a useful tool technologically and otherwise to investigate the subatomic realm. But Thomas Kuhn tells us explicitly that science then reaches a point in which the old standard paradigm, such as the old material causal paradigm of 20th century physics, comprising of both relativity theory and quantum mechanics, reaches a limit. I gave the metaphor, imagine somebody being born in a room and all of their needs are being supplied. So they live in this room and all they know of is what exists within that room. And then, so for them, the reality is just that room. And then something happens. Somebody knocks on the door. Something hits the window, which is a sealed window, so they cannot see outside. And they start suspecting that there exists something outside of this room. In other words, the reality of the room is too confined. There are certain things, phenomena, and events that are taking place which are outside the room, and they force that person to open the door. And that's what happens when science or a certain scientific discipline undergoes a paradigmatic shift. First there is a paradigmatic crisis, as Thomas Kuhn teaches us. So that's the state we just passed through, which is in a sense when the old paradigm, in this case the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, is reaching has reached a state of a paradigmatic crisis, meaning that you have apparent theoretical inconsistencies between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. You have major phenomena or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the old paradigm. Just to remind everybody, for the 19th century physics of Newtonian classical mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory, at that time there was also a paradigmatic crisis, which led to a paradigmatic shift, and that led to the discovery of relativity theory. And I'm mentioning this because this unexplained phenomena, which is an alarming sign of signifying a paradigmatic crisis and then an inevitable paradigmatic shift, in the case of Einstein's relativity theory, there was what they assumed, what Newtonian mechanics assumed to be the ether concept. And the ether concept was an elusive, hypothetical element that was supposed to perfuse the whole universe. But yet, when scientists were looking for that element, many experiments, perhaps the most famous one is the Michelson-Morley experiment, a lot of scientists eagerly looking for and trying to find and detect that elusive ether concept, and they were not able to find it. A Michelson-Morley experiment explicitly drew the conclusion that the ether concept was not detectable. And Einstein then came and said, let's cancel the ether concept and we have to do a paradigmatic shift. We have to expand the paradigm, in that case the Newtonian classical mechanics paradigm, into a broader, more valid paradigm, which was relativity theory, general relativity theory. And in fact, when Einstein's critical prediction about the double-valued Mercury's perihelion pathway around the Sun, when that was verified by Eddington's historic astronomical measurement, then the 20th century new paradigm of relativity theory, general relativity theory, was accepted. And we stand at an equivalent point. I mention that because I mentioned that in this time and age, there is a paradigmatic crisis which can be seen from the basic theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and also an unexplained phenomena, major unexplained phenomena, which is the ether concept. I'm sorry, that was with Einstein, with the dark matter, dark energy. This is the equivalent of the ether concept. In other words, scientists have been looking for 2 full decades of experimentalists and physicists looking to detect this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, but yet it cannot be found. And so I also wrote one of those 50 to 60 peer-reviewed articles which were published. I also wrote one of those 50 to 60 peer-reviewed articles in 2 special issues, etc., was called "Could Dark Matter, Dark Energy Be Superfluous?" Same way that Einstein asserted that the ether concept is superfluous. In other words, it doesn't exist. So this is where 21st century physics stands. It's shifting from the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm, which is also an acausal computational paradigm. So I want to explain briefly again what's this major change in science, what's the major discoveries, and then I will relate to specifically to the topic of today's presentation, which is the great hope of this new God's physics paradigm for science, for humanity, more generally, for us as human beings, and the power of Chuva. So the major discovery made by the new God's physics paradigm is the discovery of a singular, higher ordered, universal computational slash consciousness principle, UCP. So this universal computational consciousness principle has been discovered by the new God's physics paradigm, and it's a higher ordered singular computational or consciousness principle, universal consciousness principle, which simultaneously computes all the points in the universe, all the spatial points in the universe simultaneously. So that leads to the creation or to the existence of a series of frames. Imagine a film frame, a protocol or scenario where you have a series of frames. We see, for the naked eye, we see a plane zooming through the screen, or a bird flying through the skies. And that's what we see. But when we actually stop the frames and we look and examine the plane or the bird, etc., we see that the bird is presented at one point, and then another point, and another point. That gives us the impression of the speed or the energy of the bird or the plane, etc. So this new God's physics paradigm essentially discovered the existence of this singular higher ordered universal consciousness principle, computational consciousness principle, which produces a series of frames. They're computed at the incredible, unfathomable rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second, 50 zeros. So that means many trillions of times per second. And in between one frame and the other frame, the subsequent frame, the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. So this new paradigm, first of all, it's been shown to be able to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Second of all, it's replicated all of relativity's and quantum mechanics' major empirical findings and theoretical relationships, but it's unified relativity theory and quantum mechanics based on the discovery of this singular higher ordered universal consciousness / computational principle. And I would mention perhaps some more basic or key theoretical postulates of this new God's physics paradigm. One of them is this discovery of the computation of the universal computational formula, which essentially in one formula that appears, the more simple version of that formula appears at the bottom of this the cover of the God's physics book. Now it's been further elaborated, but this universal computational formula essentially tells us that this UCP computes simultaneously all the spatial pixels in the universe for each frame. Then the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. Then the UCP creates the whole universe in a more expanded format, so it adds certain spatial pixels with each subsequent frames. And the universal computational formula unifies between, for the first time in physics history, it unifies between the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass, which is a major accomplishment. Going beyond general relativity theory, Einstein was able to unify between space and time, energy, mass, and the curvature of space-time by massive objects, but not fully integrate mass or the gravitational force with the other three basic forces. So that's another ramification of this new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory paradigm. So this this universal computational formula essentially shows us in what manner does this new God's physics UCP create the universe, creates, dissolves, recreates, and evolves the universe. Now, another thing that I spoke about, which I think is important also for us to understand in order to speak today about the great hope and the of this new God's physics paradigm and the power of Chuva, we have to understand what's the major essence of the shift between the old material causal paradigm and the new God's physics causal computational paradigm. So I want to focus for a second about this causal computational paradigm, which is the new paradigm of God's physics. The old material causal paradigm essentially assumed that everything in the universe occurs based on cause and effect, material interaction between X and Y elements, either in the relativistic realm or subatomic quantum realm. Just to give an example, the old material causal paradigm assumes that the universe has been created by a Big Bang initial nuclear event, and that nuclear event is assumed to have caused the creation of suns, galaxies, energy, space, time, etc., the expansion of the universe. But that's an assumption that the material causal interaction has caused the creation of the universe and its expansion. The initial nuclear event causing the creation of suns, galaxies, mass, energy, etc., and the expansion of the universe. Now, if we look closely at this new God's physics, computational unified field theory paradigm, we can understand what does it mean when we say that this new paradigm is an acausal computational paradigm. Because imagine that this UCP for each consecutive frame, for each consecutive frame, it computes the whole frame simultaneously. So for the first frame, for example, of the Big Bang nuclear event, for the first frame, all of the spatial pixels have been computed simultaneously. So there cannot be any cause and effect in between them because they're all presented simultaneously. Then the universe dissolves into this UCP, and then the UCP creates a subsequent, somewhat enlarged frame, universal frame. Again, in the new frame, there cannot be any cause and effect because all the points are being presented simultaneously. In between the frames, the universe dissolves into the UCP. So, in fact, it's quite astonishing, but the new paradigm teaches us that no mass, no energy, no physical element, no physical interaction can pass from the first frame to the second frame to the third frame to the nth frame. There cannot be any material interaction, any cause and effect also in between the frames. In fact, the whole universe dissolves into this UCP and is being created and recreated all the time. So we reach the inevitable conclusion, according to the new God's physics acausal computational paradigm, that the universe doesn't exist as a continuous physical reality. The universe is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved at the incredible rate of many trillion times per second by this singular higher ordered UCP. So this alters our whole conception of the universe, and essentially we start looking at an acausal computational universe, which is completely dependent upon this higher singular higher ordered universal computational principle. Maybe I would mention another tenet or tenet of this new universal computational of this new God's physics computational unified field theory, and that is what I call the computational invariance principle. Essentially, the discovery is that since the only element that remains constant in between the frames, during the frames and in between the frames, is only this UCP. In other words, the UCP is conceptualized or is now postulated to create the whole universe, to compute for each exhaustive spatial pixel its four basic physical features of space, energy, time, and mass. So during each frame, during each consecutive frame, the universe at each of its exhaustive spatial pixels is being computed by the UCP for its four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. So during the frames, the UCP is really the only cause that's creating the universe simultaneously. In between the frames, only the UCP exists, and the whole universe has dissolved back into this UCP. So the computational invariance principle tells us that the only element which I call computational invariant throughout the alternation between universal frames and their dissolution into the UCP, and then recreation of a universal frame, and again the dissolution into the UCP, the only thing that remains constant is this UCP. That's the only thing that remains constant altogether. It's continuous, it's constant. I call it the computational invariant principle, the UCP. whereas the universe, the physical universe of space-time, energy, and mass, and the four basic physical features, those four basic physical features of space-time, energy, and mass, those are only computational variant. They exist transiently, phenomenally, during the frames as computed by the UCP, but in between the frames they cease to exist. They dissolve into this UCP. And therefore, according to this computational invariance principle, the only thing that we may regard as constant is this UCP. And why do I say that? Because that would lead us now to the focus of this exciting talk, which is the great hope of this new God's physics paradigm and the power of Chuva. I would just mention that this universal computational formula, what I said and mentioned, that it exists, it appears, it's depicted at the bottom here of this God's physics book. That universal computational formula has been now elaborated much more, and it's called the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions universal computational formula. And essentially it tells us that in order to explain the evolution of the universe, its ongoing existence and evolution, we must look at the higher ordered dimensions of this UCP. Obviously, when the UCP creates each consecutive frames, and we said that there cannot be any interaction within any frame nor in between the frames, so that makes us draw our attention and look higher and see how does the UCP, which retains every spatial pixel in the universe, when the universe dissolves back into the UCP has to retain, remember, recreate every spatial pixel simultaneously. So we start looking at the UCP itself. How does it create the universe? What's its real dynamics, so to speak? Excuse me. And one of the things that we discovered, and this leads us to the new God's physics great hope for science and for humanity more generally, is that this UCP has within its 10 hierarchical computational dimensions has a few major elements. One of them is the moral principle. For the first time in science history, a moral principle and the centrality of human consciousness and human free choice becomes a major a component of the evolution of the universe. Why? Because when we started looking at the UCP and its hierarchical computational dimensions, we found out that the UCP has a basic dynamic equilibrium moral principle. And that dynamic equilibrium moral principle essentially says that since the UCP is characterized by oneness, unity, harmony, peace, and morality, so the UCP is an integral, unified, or unitary existence. And it has this moral principle, dynamic equilibrium moral principle, which essentially says that anytime any individual human being inflicts pain, God forbid, or bestows goodness, God willing, on another human being, that triggers the universal consciousness principle or computational principles, dynamic equilibrium moral principle, to select one of multiple possible futures for these two human beings. So in other words, if we have a human being that, God forbid, inflicts pain or suffering on another human being, that human being which inflicted the pain, God forbid, would have to experience let's say, we'll talk about the power of Chuva in a second, but in a natural manner or without the Chuva element, which is very important, the UCP would then trigger the selection of one of multiple possible futures for that inflicting pain human being, for that instant, to experience a similar or an equivalent situation in which that inflicting pain human being would have to experience the same experience, negative experience, not as a punishment, but as a means for this dynamic equilibrium moral principle to teach that individual human being, and more generally the whole of humanity, that in fact we are all integral parts of that singular higher ordered moral unitary UCP. And because we're all part of that UCP, that universal consciousness reality, in religious terms we would call it God, because we're all elements of that same singular reality, then whenever there is an imbalance and a human being inflicts pain on another human being, the UCP, through the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, allows us to learn that we're all part of the same reality. So that would lead the human being which inflicted pain to experience the same kind of negative experience, and therefore realize that that's not the right way to go. And vice versa, by the way. The great Rambam, Maimonides, a great Jewish saint and sage philosopher, doctor, Maimonides taught in Judaism and the whole world that when a human being or when a Jewish person makes a choice, a moral choice, a good moral choice, then that human being tilts or shifts himself, herself, and the whole world into a better state. And so what we're discovering now with the New God's Physics paradigm is that the moral choices that we make as human beings is very important because it selects one of multiple possible futures. And just to complete that thought, so according to this New God's Physics paradigm, the UCP contains a bank, a reservoir of all the past, present, and multiple possible futures, frames, universal frames, for the universe, and that's based, the selection of one of multiple possible futures is based on the UCP's dynamic equilibrium moral principle, and is related to the moral choice of each individual human being. By the way, it's obviously very hard for us to fathom this complexity, this infinitude. Just imagine in your mind how complex this computation or this ongoing balancing act of the UCP must be. We have so many human beings in the world, so many Jews and so many human beings in the world, and the UCP, the Universal Conscious Reality, or God, has to compute and has to take care of each individual human being in order to allow that human being to advance towards a more perfected, what I call Geula state. And that's another point before I go to the theoretical ramifications and the great hope of this New God's Physics paradigm. Because essentially, instead of assuming that the universe was created by a random initial Big Bang nuclear event, and in fact, according to the old material causal paradigm, the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is drifting and expanding into nothingness. The suns will die out, the galaxies will disperse. It's all a random, chaotic, meaningless, and targetless existence of the universe. But that's the old material causal paradigm, which we say is now shifting to the New God's Physics paradigm. And the thing is, according to the New God's Physics paradigm, when we say that the UCP has a reservoir, I called it a multi-spatial temporal reservoir, the UCP's multi-spatial temporal reservoir of universal frames, that bank, that reservoir of all the universal frames, if you will, the whole history of the universe from its beginning till the ultimate goal of Geula. Geula is the perfected state in which humanity, as science is doing right now, humanity is realizing and will realize that there exists only a singular higher order universal computational or consciousness reality, and that universal conscious reality is characterized by what we've been speaking now, morality, oneness, goodness, all goodness. When humanity, science and humanity reaches that perfected state, moral, spiritual, physical perfected state, that's in a sense the culmination of, and that's the ultimate goal of the UCP's creation, evolution, and culmination in this Geula state. Geula is a Jewish term from the Jewish tradition, Kabbalah, Hasidic thought, and essentially it tells us that the way the universe operates and the way God creates the universe is to lead it towards this inevitable perfected state. But I use the same term because, in a sense, what science is discovering now is that the UCP, the Universal Consciousness Principle, or Universal Computational / Consciousness Principle, is creating the universe and is evolving the universe towards this perfected Geula state. There's no cause and effect in the standard way that we think of. So Darwin's natural selection principle is also discarded because there cannot be any cause and effect in any single or multiple universal frames. So what we start seeing, and this is where we start talking about the great hope and of this new God's physics paradigm. It's very much related to, for the Jewish people and for the whole world, in fact, with the Rosh Hashana and Yom-Kippur that we've just gone through, because now I connect this to what we started speaking about, the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, universal computational formula. That in this more elaborate universal computational formula format, we start realizing that the way that the universal conscious reality, or God, creates the world continuously, creates, dissolves, recreates, and evolves, so many trillions times per second, this UCP or UCR, universal conscious reality, is computing each simultaneously each consecutive universal frames. But the way that it's evolving those universal computational frames is by essentially making this computation time and again. In other words, it's all the time anchored in the ultimate Geula state. And just to complete the thought that I started explaining, so according to this new God's physics paradigm, the whole creation and evolution of the universe has been pre-planned. I give the example which is given also in Hasidic thought many times. When an architect or a king would build a castle, so the architect that the king has hired to build that castle would not allow any block to be put or placed to build this wonderful mansion or palace. No workers would be allowed to start building the palace before the architect has completely the blueprint for the palace, from the marbles to the pillars to the glass windows, etc., to the gold covering. Everything has been explicitly planned and pre-planned before any worker is allowed to put any cement or any brick element. So why? Because we realize that in order to build the palace, the architect has to have a complete picture of how it would look, how it will function when it's completed. And the whole build-up process of this mansion or this beautiful palace, the whole process begins with the blueprint completed, and everything going, every step along the way is actually a step forward towards completing that blueprint plan. So everything functions according to that blueprint plan, which already states the ultimate goal of this process, which is a completed palace. In this case, it's a metaphor, but in this case, so the UCP or the UCR, Universal Conscious Reality, has what I called it the reverse time Geula goal hypothesis or postulate, which essentially says that the UCR has planned the whole progression of the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and the Geula state. The Jewish people obviously following many of these commandments and laws and leading the world towards that Geula state. Geula state is again that perfected state in which the Jewish people and the whole world would realize and would identify and would live by the recognition of this universal conscious reality or God, and its moral laws and the respect of each other and the good nature, the all goodness of this universal conscious reality God. So now I think we're at a point where we can start seeing and respecting and getting the knowledge so that we can appreciate the great new hope of this new God's physics paradigm for science and for humanity more generally. Because if in fact the universe is not the world around us, our bodies, everything around us does not exist as a continuous, static, material reality. Everything around us and our bodies is created continuously, created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved by this universal consciousness reality or universal computational principle. And it's created every trillionth of a second by going through these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions. So, for example, what I mentioned about the UCP has this blueprint, this reverse time Geula goal hypothesis. That, imagine a GPS, and imagine that a Jewish person is living in Israel and aiming, getting into his car and aiming. He's in Tel Aviv and he wants to drive to Jerusalem, and he starts driving towards Jerusalem, but for some reason somebody has taken control of the car, or his wife or somebody, because he's now speaking over the phone, and the car starts going not in the direction of what the original plan was, to go to Jerusalem. It's driving now towards Eilat at the south. So the GPS software will all the time compute a new pathway in order to correct the mistake, quote unquote, so that the car would reach its initially destined location, which is Jerusalem. That's just a metaphor, but it's a little bit helpful for us to understand that the UCP is computing at every trillionth of a second how to assist us, each human being, and the whole of the humanity, the whole world, towards reaching that ultimate desired Geula state, perfected state. This is very similar, by the way, to what we know in Hasidic thought about what the Baal Shem Tov taught us, and that is that everything in the world happens for personal providence, Hashgacha Pratit. So there's nothing in the universe that happens by chance. There's a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov going with his Hasidic followers, with his disciples, and he's going through the forest, and one of his Hasidic followers had a difficulty to realize how could it be that that God, in fact, takes care and looks over every small being in the universe. How could that be? So the Baal Shem Tov stopped him and showed them a leaf just falling from a tree and hovering in the air, tossing and hovering and getting to the ground. And he told them, look at this leaf, just one example, this leaf. And he showed them that when he turned the leaf upwards, they found underneath that leaf a small worm that was suffering from the sun, from the rays of the sun. It was too hot for it. And so he told them, you see, in the same way that the leaf is pre-planned how it would fall, and that it would specifically fall over that worm to protect it from the rays of sun. That was an example the Baal Shem Tov gave to explain personal providence. And in this new God's physics paradigm, we may say it's all personal providence, because no spatial pixel exists and carries on, no object in the universe, the sun, our planet, our bodies, the trees, the birds, everything around us is being created and recreated anew at every trillionth, etc. of a second by this universal conscious reality or God. So we start seeing, first of all, there is personal providence. Everything is happening under the strict guidance and love and care of God, or this universal conscious reality. It creates, recreates, and evolves every spatial pixel in the universe. And it does so, by the way, based on this blueprint, on this ultimate goal, Geula goal state of Geula, the ultimate state of the universe of Geula. So this starts giving us a great hope, because the universe doesn't, our world doesn't operate just by cause and effect. If a person, God forbid, becomes sick with any disease, it's not just because there is a virus. It's because essentially it's part of the universal conscious reality's progression of the universe, and the moral principle starts becoming a very key element. Obviously, we cannot fathom the intelligence and the complexity of the universal conscious reality. We're too limited. But science starts telling us, through this new God's physics paradigm, that it gives us great hope. And I mentioned the example of a person becoming ill because there's great hope always. It's not cause and effect. Actually, the moral principle, the moral virtues of person, how many times that person has bestowed goodness on other people and has went out of his or her way to help other human beings, other Jews, other human beings, that counts a lot. And I want to mention the power of Chuva. The power of Chuva, so in these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions that the universal computational or consciousness principle reality goes through in order to create anew every consecutive universal frame, that includes also the Chuva. Teshuva is a Jewish term, as we all know, that relates to what the Rambam also related to, that when a Jewish person, or in fact any person, makes a Teshuva, in other words, makes a resolute decision not to repeat any negative action that he or she may have done, has remorse, and makes a resolute decision, conscious decision not to repeat that, to try his or her best not to repeat that action, but actually to act in a good way, in a different, positive way. That Teshuva is part of those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, which are part of this universal computational formula. So that means we just passed through Yom-Kippur. Yom-Kippur is the day, in the holiest day in the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, where we all for a day are fasting and asking kapara, asking for forgiveness, making Chuva. And so that day is obviously very important. I spoke about, and I've written about this extensively, that in fact, and this is also part of the great hope of this new God's physics paradigm, according to this new God's physics paradigm, the universal conscious reality, remember we spoke about the bank of all the pictures, all the universal frames, multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all the frames of the past, present, and future possible states or frames for the universe. And so according to this new paradigm, every year during the Rosh-Hashana new Jewish year, there is a bulk of a full years of the universal frames for the whole universe and for every Jewish person. In fact, for every person in the world. And during those 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, when we, the Jewish people, pray each one for the Shem, for God, or this universal conscious reality, to make Teshuva, to change our ways, to ask forgiveness from each other, to ask forgiveness from the Shem, and to make resolute decisions of Teshuva, to change our ways for the better, that then draws and determines the whole year, subsequent year, Jewish year, of the universal frames, to a large extent of the universal frames for that whole year. So it gives us great hope, because instead of thinking and believing that what would happen during this year is just cause and effect, maybe bad luck, maybe somebody God forbid, has ignored a stop sign and therefore there will be a car accident which we may be involved, God forbid, in, or something of that nature. But here we start seeing a completely different picture. First of all, the whole year, in a sense, is being pre-planned to a large extent, based on our Teshuva, based on our good moral decisions, based on God's personal providence that takes care and is with us and creates our bodies, creates our minds, creates the sun, the galaxies, the planets, the birds, the world around us. We're all the time being watched and being cared for, much as in the same way that a mother would take care of her baby and would not leave that baby for a single second, watching over his or her needs. The Shem, even much, much more so, for every trillionth of a second, is creating the universe, taking care of us, leading us, even, by the way, when we experience what seems to us as a negative event, that's also part of the Shems, or the universal conscious realities, attempt to rectify and to balance us in order to reach a more perfected state. And the great power of Teshuva and the great hope of Teshuva is that for sure during those 10 days in Yom-Kippur, but even beyond that, every single second, every trillionth of a second, the Shem is laboring with us in order to, when a person makes Teshuva, even if a certain future, one of multiple possible futures, has been selected for that individual, that Jewish person or that individual human being, in order to allow that person to grow and to balance towards the perfected state. Even if something which was supposed to happen, which seems to us negative, when the person makes Teshuva, makes a conscious reflection and choice, decision to change his or her ways in a particular positive manner, that offsets and eliminates the need for that person to experience what seems to us as a negative experience, even though that is also geared towards perfecting and teaching us and bringing us and the whole world into a more positive state. So Teshuva can offset and actually select one of multiple positive futures based on the sincere remorse and decision of the Jewish person or human being to change their ways. So we start living in a much more hopeful, in a very hopeful universe. It gives us great hope. As human beings, we realize that nothing in our life happens by chance, that we're being watched over, being cared for, that everything in our life is, in a sense, being computed by this universal conscious reality in order to allow us to grow, in order to allow humanity and us as human beings and as Jewish individuals, people, to grow and evolve, perfect our own moral character, and reach inevitably that Geula state, a perfected state. So I think we stand at a very exciting time. I've called, and I'm repeatedly calling, scientists, universities, astronomers, cosmologists all over the world to communicate with me directly. I've given my personal email. I'll give it again. drbentwich@gmail.com, drbentwich@gmail.com, all lowercase letters. And I'm eagerly expecting to get positive results for that would validate the one of the unique critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm about the non-continuous expansion of the universe during the Rosh-Hashana Jewish New Year, 2 days time interval. This year it was on September 7th and 8th, 2021. And it's very important for me to share this new knowledge and this new understanding of the universe, of God's physics. It gives us great hope. It gives science and humanity a great opportunity, window of opportunity to realize that the universe has not been created by a random Big Bang nuclear event. It's not drifting aimlessly towards nothingness. It's actually being guided, created, watched over, cared for, and being, in a sense, driven towards that Geula perfected state, which is the ultimate state of the universe. science is called to validate this new God's physics paradigm, and by doing so, it would allow both science and humanity to advance towards a much more hopeful and much more perfected state. Thank you very much.